All right. I am very pleased to introduce the Reverend Dr. Julius Carroll and the Reverend Dr. Kenneth Simurro. We're going to have so many degrees here on the stage. And they are going to share with us the history of and the realities we face regarding this being 400 years since the arrival of African slaves to this country. In USA Today, in last Friday's edition, there was an article on the last slave ship to this country, the Clotilda, which was recently found near Mobile, Alabama. It's just another reminder of this country's complicity in one of the most heinous periods in our history, and we are pleased and honored to have Julius and Kenneth lead us through some time in reflection on this. So the floor is yours.
Good morning, Assembly. Good morning. The first recorded enslaved Africans to the British mainland colonies, which would become the United States, came to Jamestown, Virginia in August of 1619, 400 years ago. They were abducted from Western Africa in the region called Angola. Some 20 black people were the vanguard of what would become a thriving business in human trafficking, which numbered in the millions. The system would routinely strip the enslaved Africans of their language, their names, culture, families, religion, and possessions. In short, attempting to dehumanize, reprogram, and commodify human beings into black bodies rather than black people. This form of slavery differed in some ways from what had come before. Very few of those sitting in this room can claim their ancestors were never enslaved, as the practice has been ubiquitous. Worldwide, down through the ages, American slavery had a twist marking it as unique. Colorism was used by whites to choose who would be seen as non-human, uneducable, undeserving of protections, lacking agency over their own bodies, prevented from being able to protect themselves from horrific abuses like rape and murder, and on and on. No upside to the system if you were black. Slavery, sometimes called America's original sin, wove itself into white culture. Fear of black insurrection and violence, hypersexualization of black people, and objectification of black bodies, instability of consistently undermined black families, and prohibition of owning their own means of production. Once normalized, these and other tropes became institutionalized in the colonies and were projected down through time in white culture and the arts, law, religion, economics, and ethics. When the colonies became an independent nation, slavery was codified into the U.S. Constitution and protected. Remember from your U.S. history and government classes in high school, the 3/5 rule, where black people were enumerated as 3/5 of a person. Enslaved people were acted upon rather than seen as actors and governors of their own destiny. An entire rationale was created of white supremacy, black inferiority, biblical proof texting eisegetics to support the system. pseudoscience of white European dominion, even the protection of the Southern way of life, and white women's racial purity in the antebellum South. Layers of protection were manufactured to undergird and protect the ruthlessness of chattel slavery and perpetuate its mythology. But where were the Lutherans in all of this from 1619 to 1865? My brother, Reverend Dr. Julius Carroll, will take us along the way down through time in our own neck of the woods.
We want to thank Marilyn Simurro, who is living out her baptism gift of the power of the PowerPoint, and we thank her for doing that. 400 years ago in Jamestown, Virginia, God's created human beings were deposited on North American soil as chattel. We as a nation are still emotionally, psychologically, and politically dealing with this stain on North American history. On Palm Sunday, 1669, a Lutheran pastor in Albany, New York, baptized into his congregation what is now First Lutheran, an African-American man who was given the baptismal name Emmanuel, God with us. So as we gather as a synod of Lutherans in the state, if not the city, in which Emmanuel became our brother in Christ, we are invited to reflect on a Lutheran witness during slavery in the United States of America. The two oldest Lutheran professional associations, the Pennsylvania and New York Ministerium, did not officially consider the question of slavery before the Civil War. This, however, must not be seen as evidence of indifference. Rather, there is compelling evidence in their governing documents that challenging the social construct of slavery would be crossing the line between separation of church and state. However, these ministeria did not express the position of all Lutheran bodies in the state of Pennsylvania and New York, bringing the sin of slavery home to upstate New York. In 1830, the Hartwick Synod, representing churches around Albany and Westwood, was formed by the withdrawal of churches from the New York Ministerium because of dissatisfaction with the position of the New York Ministerium regarding slavery. At the New York Ministerium Convention in 1836, the subject of abolition of slavery was introduced in the form of a preamble protesting slavery. After discussion begun in the morning session and continuing in the afternoon, it was decided that the subject of the abolition of slavery should be indefinitely postponed. At the next convention, September 1837, the president of the ministerium included the following statement in his report: "And let us be on our guard that whilst engaged in the good work of temperance, we act upon the principle of love, and whilst agitating the great question that involves Southern interest, and as some might think, Northern accountability, we are urging no coercive measures to oppress the churches. No further mention of the subject was made at that time, but it was touched upon 2 years later when it was resolved that contention and strife in politics are inconsistent with the spirit of religion and dangerous to Christian principle, and that the members of the churches in our connection be earnestly and affectionately requested to abstain those party feelings and animosities which cause division among Christian brethren and bring a reproach on religion. What is not discussed on paper is that the question of slavery had very seriously affected the strength and the peace of the Hartwick Synod. In May 1837, largely because of the attitude of a majority in the Hartwick Synod, a group of ministers with their churches had withdrawn to organize a new and competing body, the Frankian Synod. Impatient with the ways of even the moderate Hartwick Synod, this little group developed a set of attitudes and practices in both church-related and secular interests, to which the word radical may be applied. Because of its position regarding slavery, the Frankian Synod was denied for several decades admittance into even the confessionally, theologically liberal General Synod. As the saying goes in the indigenous black church, the Frankians went from preaching to meddling. The attitude and activities of the Frankian Synod with respect to slavery represents the greatest degree of opposition to that institution to be found among Lutheran bodies. And indeed, it is doubtful if any group in any denomination exhibited a more extreme position right here in upstate New York. This section of New York was a hotbed of abolitionism, and the attitude of the common folk was extreme. Here, the Lutheran Church was not strong and naturally designed to be recognized as regular folk. Some of its leaders were no doubt glad for the opportunity to show their agreement with majority opinion, not only in such social matters as an attitude toward slavery, but also in matters of doctrine and church practice. There seems to be no doubt that some unorthodox Lutheran teachings, dare we say spirited and spirit-filled forms of worship, profoundly affected the Frankian Synod and caused it to depart so far from the traditional Lutheran ways of thinking and doing that it was viewed suspiciously by nearly every other Lutheran Synod. Don't you love them already? Speaking truth to power. In May of 1837, at a meeting of pastors and laymen in Central and East Central New York who were dissatisfied with the trend in the Hartwick Synod, a constitution with certain unusual provisions was unanimously adopted. No layman was to be entitled to a seat in the conventions who was a slaveholder or in the liquor business. I don't know about that one. No minister could be a member of the Synod who was a slaveholder or who trafficked in human beings or who advocated the system of slavery as it existed in the United States. On the day after the Constitution had been adopted, the convention of the Frankian Synod was held. Under the heading of American slavery, the following resolutions were adopted. Resolved, that slavery as it exists in the United States is a sin, opposed to the spirit of the gospel, and a violation of the inalienable rights of human beings. Resolved, that we do not deem it inexpedient for church bodies to interfere with the abolition of slavery, but that it is the duty of all such bodies of every evangelical denomination to bear the decided testimony against the sin of slavery. Resolved, that we have abundant cause for deep humiliation before God, that as a denomination we are so deeply involved in the sin of slavery and that so many of our ministers practice the crime and that so many others justify them in this iniquity. Resolved, that we view the traffic in human beings as carried on in this country between the ministers of the gospel and members of the churches as revolting to humanity and as repugnant to the laws of Christ as ever was the foreign slave trade. At the Frankian Synodical Convention held in June 1838, several items of interest are to be noted in their minutes. Our decided testimony against American slavery was given, and it was declared that we as a synodical body are averse to American slavery because it is void of truth and love. Slavery was held to be opposed to the Bible and its claims, while it was contended that the church should not interfere. That is to say, that the church has no right to oppose and reform all evil and heaven-provoking sins. The next year, a report on American slavery was concurred unanimously and ordered published in the Lutheran Herald, a periodical which the Frankian Synod began to publish in January 1839. An extensive report of action with respect to slavery was given in the same journal, including anti-slavery resolutions. These set forth that whereas slavery pollutes the Church of God, it was resolved that it was the duty of every church to fight the system in order to free the slaves and save the country. That the cause of the abolition of slavery is, they wrote, the cause of God. That indifference was incompatible with the principles and spirit of Christianity. That ignorance could not excuse the sins of the slaveholders and their apologists, and little confidence could be reposed in their acts of worship. And finally, that the Synod approved the Constitution and organization of the American and foreign anti-slavery society. The Frankians picking up their cross. The influence of the Frankian Synod, small in numbers though it was felt at even this early date of 1839, for it came under the notice of the general Synod at its convention in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. At this time, both the Franklin and Tennessee Synods, you see, suffered the condemnation of the General Assembly because of its anti-slavery activities. The General Synod declared that the proceedings and practices of the Franklin Synod were disapproved, and all the churches were exhorted to beware of the efforts of these men, both of the Franklin and Tennessee Synods, to cause division and offenses contrary to the spirit of the gospel. Pressing on. At the opening of the 1840s, Franklin Synod became, if possible, more zealous in the cause for abolitionism. In 1841, it unanimously passed a motion to recommend to the ministers and churches not to admit to their pulpits and the Lord's Supper any person who is a slaveholder or who traffics in human beings, and it resolved unanimously that it was the duty of Christian ministers and all Christian churches to rebuke the accursed system of slavery. And the most aggressive action which the Synod took at this time was the preparation and transmission of a fraternal appeal on the subject of American slavery. This was to be transmitted to each evangelical Lutheran Synod in the United States and published in the Lutheran Herald. In 1850, the Franklin Synod numbered 50 churches and 3,200 communicants, a notable growth considering its situation. At its convention in 1851, it adopted strong resolutions on civil government and the fugitive slave law. So, sisters and brothers in synodical assembly, this is our Lutheran witness regarding the fight against slavery in upstate New York. The Synod named in memory of the pietist leader of the foundation of the University at Halle, August Hermann Francke. This Synod, Our Roots, ordained an African-American Lutheran pastor, Daniel Payne, called to an African-American congregation in Troy, New York, still trying to find the name of that church, and who later became a presiding bishop of the African Methodist Episcopal Church and the president of Wilberforce University in Ohio. But alas, the Franklin Synod ceased to exist when the General Synod, General Council, and the General Synod of the South merged to form the United Lutheran Church in America in 1918. So as we remember the arrival of God's created human beings as slaves onto North American shores, we give thanks to God for the Frankians' witness to the sinfulness of that act, and for their advocacy and for their agitation in striving to make God's will that all people be free.
Thank you, Dr. Carroll. But what has happened in the Lutheran Church in the United States since the Civil War in regard to the full inclusion of formerly enslaved Black Americans? It would take more than the time allotted to even highlight the trajectory of African descent people in our predecessor bodies. Progress toward full inclusion is an ephemeral goal, and there are piles of documents and anecdotal narratives of African American pastors and lay people supporting such a judgmental and blanket statement. One of our pastors in the Upstate New York Synod has been compiling such a record as to make sure the history is not swept aside or forgotten in the flow of current events. But I will lay out markers for your edification. It came to my attention that the old LCA, one of our predecessor Lutheran bodies, that some congregations in the Southeast U.S. had stipulations in their constitutions banning black membership, and that was as late as 1982. Some of us have read the social statements of both the former LCA and current ELCA on race relations, and we have voted on resolutions as recently as the last Upstate New York Synod Assembly, upholding the goal of full inclusion of African Americans in a 96% white denomination. Back in 1987, the new ELCA set a goal that in 10 years, it would attain a membership of 10% people of color and language other than English. How did that work out? Note that the Lutheran magazine, a predecessor of the current Living Lutheran, an article within the last several years noted our membership is at or near the very bottom of the least inclusive denominations in the United States. The verbiage we write and vote upon must be more than right posturing for public consumption to make us look good. It must move action and money to the forefront. Let's not stop here. Black pastors and lay professionals have an immensely difficult time securing calls or positions in this denomination's congregations who hunger for pastoral and trained leadership, just not their leadership. Overt and covert racism within its concomitant obfuscation and gaslighting effects leads to a practice akin to real estate steering, where the phrase, "You'll be more at home there among your own kind." These statements might be shocking, illicit, not us, or evoke vigorous denunciations of reverse racism. When the majority white membership hears the often discounted voices of those directly affected by the daily microaggressions, as well as the economic and social toll exacted by being in white spaces, then their observations and feelings may lead the way toward meaningful change. Let me conclude with a few statements. Our racial status quo is resilient, and calling it out in our own institutions makes for extreme discomfort. Ask yourselves, why are whites uncomfortable about this? To white Lutherans who are appalled at what we have heard and seen perpetrated against black and brown people, and decry racism among us practiced by individuals, I say it is the underlying structures, socialization, and dynamics that keep white racism in place. We all have a participatory role to play, just not sitting on the sidelines as observers. And lastly, I call all to recognition of the sin of racism, confession of participation and benefiting in its privileges, and complicity in its perpetuation, repentance and examination, and meaningful ongoing actions that show true change. Following this session of the plenary, at lunch, Dr. Carroll and my wife, Marilyn Saxon Simurro, and I will be in the Lilac Ballroom, and we will have some tables set up there where, if you'd like to sit with us and continue the conversation, we'd be most happy to have you. And also at the afternoon's presentations, Marilyn and I will be in, I guess that is called Section E, and we will have that presentation, an opportunity to discuss in one of the breakout sessions. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, and thank you for availing yourselves to the assembly even beyond the time of this presentation. So I encourage you to take those opportunities while they are available to you.